My son looked me in the eyes after the funeral and said, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's fortune. $92 million, and not an ounce of grace to spare." That was the day I realized grief has many faces. Some wear black, and others wear greed. When I came downstairs that morning, the scent of roses still clung to my dress. They hadn't even finished shoveling the last bit of earth over my husband's grave before the house filled up again, only this time, not with mourners, but with scavengers. The halls that once echoed with our laughter now hummed with chatter, clinking glasses and the sound of footsteps claiming what wasn't yet theirs. My grandson slapped neon sticky notes on everything in sight. The grandfather clock, the old leather chair, even the china cabinet that had survived 3 generations of dinners. "This one's mine," he said, as if announcing a conquest. His sister wasn't far behind, waving her phone like a magic wand, an app mapping out my home for her next project. "Once she's out," she murmured, "we'll knock down this wall, make a spa room, maybe a wine bar." They spoke of renovations while I still smelled like morning. No one offered me a chair, not even a glance. My daughter-in-law floated by with a tray of champagne flutes and said brightly, "We're celebrating Dad's legacy. He built an empire, and now we carry it forward." Forward, I thought. Over my body, perhaps. Someone laughed from the dining room. "Let's clear out the ghosts while we're at it." And they all joined in, the laughter bouncing off walls that had once heard bedtime stories and lullabies. When I finally sat down, it wasn't at the grand table where I'd served countless meals. They'd replaced my chair with a folding one from the garage. No cushion, one leg shorter than the rest. They pointed me toward the mudroom, as if grief belonged in storage. So there I sat, eating cold chicken from a paper plate, watching shadows of my own family divide up my life. They didn't notice the paper tucked inside my cardigan pocket, a document older than their arrogance. 15 years old, signed, stamped, and sealed. Proof that when my husband's empire began to crumble, it was my hands that steadied it. I sold every piece of jewelry I owned, my mother's emerald necklace, my wedding bangles, even the brooch I wore the day I said I do. He promised to keep my secret. He kept it well. They thought they were feasting on his legacy. They had no idea they were standing on mine. And as I sat in that folding chair, surrounded by laughter that felt colder than winter, I realized I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot, because sometimes the quietest woman in the room is the one holding the loudest truth. They think they know the story of our success. A man's dream, a man's courage, a man's empire. But dreams don't stand without foundations, and courage often leans on a quieter kind of strength. Mine. 15 years ago, our world was crumbling. My husband came home late one evening, his tie loosened, eyes hollow, silence heavier than words. The numbers had turned against him, clients gone, contracts broken, the company on the brink of collapse. He stood before the fireplace, staring into the flames like he was trying to burn his shame away. "We just need one more deal," he said. "If the New York investors sign, we'll survive." But he didn't have what they demanded. Collateral and pride can be an expensive thing for a man to carry. That night, while he slept, I opened the drawer beneath his cufflinks and took out the velvet box that held my last treasures. The diamond earrings from our wedding, my mother's emerald ring, the heavy gold bangles from my dowry. Each one had a story. Each one had a heartbeat. And one by one, I let them go. The next morning, I walked to the bank and wired every cent to the company's escrow account. I signed it quietly, under my name. Then I came home, made breakfast, and said only this: "Use it, but don't ever let them know where it came from." He didn't ask. He never did. Some men can face bankruptcy, but not the truth that their salvation came from their wife's hands. 2 days later, the deal closed. The investors signed. The company lived. They called him a visionary, a genius, a miracle. They never said my name. A month later, they printed new brochures. I still remember seeing his face on the cover, bold and confident, under a line that read, "Legacy Built Alone." I smiled when I saw it, the kind of smile that hides a storm. They called it pride. I called it patience. But patience has an expiration date. For years I stayed behind the curtain, feeding the empire in silence while they praised the man on stage. They never wondered who ironed the very suit he wore to sign the papers, who balanced the numbers when he couldn't sleep, who built the soup that kept the household standing when everything else was falling apart. They thought I was just the woman in the kitchen, but I was also the architect in the shadows. And one day soon, the shadows would start speaking. It's strange how people measure intelligence by titles, offices, and plaques. But wisdom doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it wears an apron. I remember that night as clearly as if it were yesterday. My husband was pacing the den, tie half undone, muttering numbers under his breath. His board had rejected his latest pitch. Again. The industry was shifting faster than he could follow, and pride had built a wall he couldn't climb. He didn't notice me standing in the doorway holding his untouched dinner. When he finally went to bed, I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once taught our son his alphabets, and pulled out a notepad, a cup of chamomile beside me. The old lamp flickering, I started to write. I wasn't new to this world. Before I became Mrs. Brightwood, I was a woman with my own degree, my own ideas, and a job I loved. But in marriage, I traded reports for recipes and memos for memories. I told myself it was enough. Until that night. The pen moved like it remembered what my heart had forgotten. I built a proposal from scratch, an expansion plan that predicted the future of our market. Supply chain reform, multi-phase investments, a sustainable model that could carry them through decades. By the time the birds began to sing, the ink had stained my fingertips blue. I signed it, not with my name, but with a small pseudonym I'd once used in college, E. Sinclair. It felt like leaving a fingerprint in the dark, quiet, unseen, but real. The next morning, I sealed the papers in an envelope and mailed them to his office. No return address, no trace, only faith. 2 days later, he came home with a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen in months. "Someone sent in a proposal," he said, laughing. "It's brilliant. Even the handwriting looks a little like yours." I just smiled and stirred the soup. That proposal became the foundation of the company's IPO 6 months later. It saved everything. Investors called it the Brightwood Miracle. The papers called it genius. They called him self-made. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. Back then, I thought silence was a kind of love, that letting him shine was the right thing to do. But silence, when stretched too long, doesn't sound like love. It starts to sound like erasure. And I had been quiet for far too long. Years have a way of blurring, don't they? You fold one into the next, and before you know it, decades have passed. Decades of dinners, holidays, and polite smiles that hide exhaustion. They called me devoted. They called me steady. No one ever called me brilliant. But I remember everything. The nights I stayed up balancing the numbers he couldn't face. The mornings I packed his briefcase with sandwiches and strategy notes. The years I kept quiet when praise skipped over me like sunlight missing the corner of a room. Now, as I sit here in this house, the one I once made a home, I watch them paste neon stickers on furniture and laugh about spa rooms. They call it carrying on the legacy. I call it dismantling a memory. They don't know. They've never known. Upstairs, beneath the linen shelf, there's an old folder wrapped in a piece of lace from my wedding veil. Inside it lives the truth they buried under their arrogance. My handwriting, my diagrams, my calculations, the original proposal, my pen name signed in the corner, ink slightly smudged from the night I wrote it. Next to it, a letter from the patent office. It arrived years ago, long after the company went public. I'd registered the intellectual property quietly under that same pseudonym. A precaution, really. One of those instincts that women grow after being overlooked for too long. For years, royalty checks have come in, neatly folded inside plain white envelopes. I never cashed a single one. Money wasn't what I wanted. What I needed was peace. The quiet satisfaction of knowing what I'd built, even if the world didn't. But peace doesn't survive mockery. The day I overheard them laughing about me. She built soup. He built an empire. Something shifted. That old patience cracked. It wasn't anger that filled me. It was clarity. I realized that silence had served its purpose. It had protected them long enough. Now, it was time to protect the truth. So I took the folder out. My hands trembled a little, not from weakness, but from remembering. Every page, every letter, every sleepless night was still there, proof that I wasn't a bystander in this story. I was the author. And soon the world, or at least this family, would have to read it. Because the truth, once unboxed, has a way of echoing louder than all the laughter in the house. The morning after they measured my bedroom for a spa conversion, I woke before dawn. The house was still. Too still. Even the air seemed to hesitate, as if afraid to disturb their new plans for my exile. I sat on the edge of the cot they'd placed in the laundry room. My knees ached, my hands were stiff, but my mind was sharp. Sharper than they remembered. I slid the old folder from beneath the loose floorboard and rested it on my lap. The leather was cracked, worn soft from years of waiting inside. Was everything they had forgotten about me. The joint trust certificate, where my name sat beside my husband's, not below it. The bank agreement signed and notarized 15 years ago, showing the exact deposit that kept the company alive when it should have died. And my favorite piece, the handwritten draft of the IPO proposal. I ran my fingers across the paper and whispered, "You're coming back into the light." They thought age had dulled me. They were wrong. It had only made me patient. That morning, I bundled myself in an old coat, the same one they'd once called depressing, and walked 2 blocks to the payphone outside the pharmacy. They'd cut off my cell service weeks ago. "Just simplifying the bills," they'd said. But I hadn't forgotten Mr. Alden's number, my husband's lawyer, the only man who'd ever looked me in the eye like I still mattered. When he picked up, his voice was the same steady tone I remembered. "It's time," I said softly. He didn't ask for details. He just replied, "Come in tomorrow." The next day I stepped into his office, a room that smelled faintly of coffee and old law books. He looked up, surprised but not shocked. "You look well," he said gently. "I've been underestimated," I replied, setting the folder on his desk page by page. I laid my life bare. The trust certificate, the bank memorandum, the drafts signed with my pseudonym. He read quietly, occasionally nodding, his brow furrowing deeper with each document. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, eyes gleaming behind his glasses. "You understand what this means, don't you?" I nodded. "I don't want revenge. I just want the truth in ink." He smiled, slow and certain. "Then let's make sure the ink holds." For the first time in years, I walked out of an office with my head high. The air outside tasted like promise and justice. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's legally binding. Mr. Alden didn't waste time. The moment I left his office, wheels began to turn. Quiet ones, invisible to those too busy bragging about their inheritance-to-be. Over the next week, I received short, polite updates written in his neat, careful handwriting. Each one began with progress steady. I liked that. Steady felt like me. He had called in a handwriting expert from Stanford, a young woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper gaze. She spent hours comparing the loops and lines of my old drafts with the anonymous proposal the company had built its empire on. Every swirl of ink, every pause in my pen matched perfectly 100% certainty, the report said. Authorship. Mine. I sat with that word for a long time. authorship. It meant more than ownership. It meant I wasn't a footnote. I was the author of a story they'd stolen. Mr. Alden handed me a new folder, this one embossed in gold. "All verified," he said. "Patent law favors the originator, and your documentation is airtight. This could alter the entire estate." I smiled faintly. "Good. Let it alter their comfort." But I didn't want to destroy them. I just wanted the truth to stand taller than their greed. My husband, bless his soul, had loved me in his own quiet, complicated way. He'd just forgotten how much of him was built from me. I didn't blame him anymore. But I couldn't forgive the ones who had mocked my existence while sipping champagne from glasses I'd once polished. As the days passed, I waited. I moved slowly through the house, unseen as always, watching them plan their future on the bones of my past. They thought I was fading, old, tired, irrelevant. But I was simply gathering, watching, remembering. Every sticky note they slapped on a piece of furniture felt like another push toward justice. "This one's mine," they said again and again. And all I could think was, "You'll find out soon enough whose name is written beneath yours." Mr. Alden's final letter arrived sealed with a silver emblem. Inside was a single line. "The reading is scheduled for Tuesday, 10 a.m. Bring your pulse." I laughed when I read it. The first real laugh I'd let myself have in months. They thought the will would bury me once and for all. They didn't realize it would resurrect me instead. Because the moment they opened that will, they wouldn't just meet my husband's legacy. They'd finally meet mine. The morning of the will reading felt colder than it should have. The sky hung heavy with rain, and even the air outside the law office seemed to hold its breath. They made me sit at the far end of the table, a folding chair again, naturally. They said it was for comfort. I knew better. They just didn't want me in the family portraits they were already picturing. My son, James, sat nearest to the front, freshly shaved, cufflinks gleaming. His wife leaned close, whispering in his ear, both of them smiling like winners waiting for their prize. My grandchildren scrolled through their phones, tapping and smirking, already planning which cars or condos they'd claim first. Not one of them looked my way. When Mr. Alden entered, briefcase in hand, the room shifted. He had that kind of presence, calm but commanding, like someone who knows where all the bodies are buried. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "Today, we gather to execute the final wishes of Mr. William Hartman." No one noticed the subtle pause he placed before final wishes. He opened a thin folder, pulled out a small recorder, and pressed play. My husband's voice filled the room. It was softer than I remembered, aged but deliberate. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," he began, "deduct $1 million per word." Silence. For a full 10 seconds, the room was silent. Then came the sound of a pen hitting the floor. James shot upright. "This is a joke. You can't—" But I laughed when I read it. The first real laugh I'd let myself have in months. They thought the will would bury me once and for all. They didn't realize it would resurrect me instead. Because the moment they opened that will, they wouldn't just meet my husband's legacy. They'd finally meet mine. The morning of the will reading felt colder than it should have. The sky hung heavy with rain, and even the air outside the law office seemed to hold its breath. They made me sit at the far end of the table, a folding chair again, naturally. They said it was for comfort. I knew better. They just didn't want me in the family portraits they were already picturing. My son, James, sat nearest to the front, freshly shaved, cufflinks gleaming. His wife leaned close, whispering in his ear, both of them smiling like winners waiting for their prize. My grandchildren scrolled through their phones, tapping and smirking, already planning which cars or condos they'd claim first. Not one of them looked my way. When Mr. Alden entered, briefcase in hand, the room shifted. He had that kind of presence, calm but commanding, like someone who knows where all the bodies are buried. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "Today, we gather to execute the final wishes of Mr. William Hartman." No one noticed the subtle pause he placed before final wishes. He opened a thin folder, pulled out a small recorder, and pressed play. My husband's voice filled the room. It was softer than I remembered, aged but deliberate. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," he began, "deduct $1 million per word." Silence. For a full 10 seconds, the room was silent. Then came the sound of a pen hitting the floor. James shot upright. "This is a joke. You can't—" Mr. Alden raised a hand and turned another page. "We have verified transcripts," he said calmly. "Security recordings from the home. 3 days after the funeral." He began reading aloud. 1. She's still breathing. 2. Thought she'd be gone by now. 3. Check her pulse at the reading. 4. She built soup. He built an empire. Every word echoed through the room like thunder. Mr. Alden paused. There were 88 such statements. You can do the math. James's face drained of color. His wife's hand slipped from his arm. My granddaughter stopped pretending to text. I sat quietly, my fingers folded in my lap, my pulse steady. When Mr. Alden continued, his tone softened. As for the remaining assets, the trust, the royalties, and the estate itself, they pass in full to Mrs. Eleanor Hartman, co-founder, co-executor, and primary beneficiary. The papers rustled like dry leaves in the wind. James whispered, barely audible, "You're lying." I finally spoke. "The first time all morning?" "No," I said gently. "I'm just alive." And the dead can't speak, but the forgotten finally can. The silence that followed Mr. Alden's words wasn't ordinary silence. It was heavy, like air before a storm, thick with disbelief and the first taste of reckoning. James sat frozen, his mouth slightly open. His wife reached for her phone, probably to text their lawyer, but her fingers trembled too much to type. My grandchildren just stared, the shine of arrogance finally dimming in their eyes. Mr. Alden didn't stop there. He had only just begun. "There's an addendum," he said, opening another folder. His tone was calm, but his eyes flicked toward me, a silent acknowledgement that this was the part I had been waiting for. He unfolded a document carefully, as if handling history itself. "This concerns intellectual property rights pertaining to the Hartman investment model." James blinked. "That's Dad's IPO strategy. What does that have to do with anything?" Mr. Alden turned the page, unfazed. 15 years ago, an anonymous proposal was submitted to the firm. It contained the exact framework that saved the company from bankruptcy and became the foundation for its global expansion. The document was signed under a pseudonym, E. Sinclair. I watched the color drain from his face. "That pseudonym," Mr. Alden continued, "was recently matched through forensic handwriting analysis, ink composition, and postal records to your mother." Gasps filled the room. Someone muttered, "That's impossible." But Mr. Alden wasn't finished. He lifted another page, a certificate embossed with the federal seal. "This document formally recognizes Mrs. Eleanor Hartman as the sole intellectual originator of the Hartman model, a patent yielding annual royalties of approximately $9 million. The weight of those words rippled through the air like a shockwave. James's voice cracked. She made soup." Mr. Alden smiled faintly, almost kindly. "Yes, and she also built the foundation that fed you all." He unfolded one last envelope, yellowed around the edges. "Before his passing, Mr. Hartman left this note for his wife." His voice softened as he read, "You found the cure before the world knew it was sick. I took the credit because the board would not follow a woman. But I always knew the truth. You were the mind, and I was merely the face." No one dared breathe. The sound of rain outside the window was the only movement in the room. For years they had laughed at me, dismissed me, spoken about me like I was already gone. But now, every word they had ever used to belittle me had turned into evidence of their blindness. They thought I was just the hand that stirred the pot, but I was the one who wrote the recipe for their entire world. The room stayed frozen. No one dared move, not even breathe. For the first time in years, their eyes were on me, not with pity, not with annoyance, but with the dawning realization that everything they thought they owned had been built on the back of the woman they ignored. Mr. Alden closed the folder gently. As per Mr. Hartman's instructions and the court's confirmation, all patents, royalties, and estate properties now belong solely to Mrs. Eleanor Hartman. The words hit like thunder wrapped in velvet. James tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. You can't mean all of it. Mr. Alden adjusted his glasses. Every part of it, I'm afraid, including this house, the vehicles, and the remaining corporate shares. The will is binding. I sat there, hands folded neatly in my lap, letting the silence do the talking for me. I didn't need to raise my voice. Justice had already spoken. James's wife, Rebecca, turned to him, face pale and tight. You said she had nothing, she hissed. He didn't answer. He just stared at the table, the proud tilt of his chin finally gone. Across from them, my granddaughter, the same one who'd once joked about my pension checks, began to cry softly. The sound was small, like a confession. Mr. Alden slid a small black folder toward me. Here, Mrs. Hartman, these are the transfer deeds and the patent certifications. Congratulations. The folder was heavier than I expected, not in weight, but in meaning. It wasn't revenge I held in my hands. It was recognition, something I had waited a lifetime to touch. I rose slowly. My knees protested, but my spirit didn't. I looked at the family I had fed, clothed, and defended, the ones who thought kindness was weakness. You buried me while I was still breathing, I said softly. Too bad you never checked my pulse. James's face crumpled. For a fleeting second, I saw my little boy again, the one who used to hold my hand crossing the street, but I couldn't carry him anymore. He had to face the truth alone. I turned to Mr. Alden. Will that be all? He nodded, eyes glimmering with something between respect and pride. I picked up my old beige coat, the one they'd mocked as depressing, and walked toward the door. Behind me, no one moved. No one dared. They thought they'd silenced me, but they forgot. Silence isn't absence. It's preparation. They were given 48 hours to vacate the house. That's what the letter from the court said. Stamped, sealed, and final. By sunrise, the once noisy estate was filled with the dull rhythm of boxes sliding across floors and the hollow thud of footsteps that had lost their certainty. The laughter that once echoed off these walls was gone, replaced by silence and the rustle of shame. I walked through the halls slowly, letting my fingers brush over the walls I once polished with lemon oil and love. The same walls they had planned to tear down. Now, they couldn't wait to escape them. James approached me once, shoulders slumped, eyes red. Mom, he whispered, please. I didn't know. I looked at him for a long moment. There was a time when those same eyes begged for bedtime stories and comfort after bad dreams, but I wasn't the same woman who used to chase away his monsters. This time, he had become one. You spoke first, I said softly. The will simply listened. He lowered his gaze and didn't follow me again room by room. I began peeling off the little colored stickers they'd left behind. The blue one from the antique dresser, the pink one from the grandfather clock, the green one from the silver frame that held our wedding photo. Each one carried the same arrogant words. This one's mine. I folded every sticker one by one and dropped them into the trash, not in anger, in peace. Because they were wrong all along. Nothing truly belongs to those who forget gratitude. When I reached the piano, the one my husband used to play on quiet evenings, I stopped. Someone had placed a sticker there, too. I traced the keys gently and whispered, "This one was always his." Then I closed the lid. The house felt different now. Not empty, just clean, like it had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Outside, I stepped onto the porch. The roses were gone, uprooted last summer, but near the corner the old pomegranate tree still stood, twisted, stubborn, alive. Beside it, a small rose bush clung to the soil, one brittle stem left standing. I fetched the watering can from the shed, rusted but still loyal. As the water poured, I whispered, "We bloom again." Because that's what women like me do. We bloom again, not for them, but for ourselves. And this time, when I bloom, the world will remember my name. I sold the house the following spring, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because peace deserves new walls. Some places hold too much noise, too many echoes of laughter that wasn't kind and footsteps that didn't belong. I realized no amount of cleaning could wash away what had been said between those walls. So I let it go. The sale was quick. The papers were signed. And with the royalties that kept flowing from the patent, steady, quiet, unbothered, I moved to a small penthouse near the ocean in Santa Barbara. It wasn't grand like the estate, but it was mine in every way that mattered. White curtains swayed in the breeze. The floor glowed gold at sunset. And every morning the sound of the waves greeted me like an old friend. No folding chairs, no whispered insults, no neon stickers claiming what I had built. Just peace, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. I didn't fill the apartment with much. Just a few essentials, a few memories, and the things that had survived both time and cruelty. One of them was an old photograph of my husband and me, taken before the weight of ambition changed him. I kept it on the windowsill, not as forgiveness, but as remembrance. The royalties still came every quarter, more money than I could ever need. But instead of letting it sit idle, I did what my heart told me to do. I started something new. A fund. A small foundation with a long name. The Women Who Were Erased. It wasn't built for fame or attention. There were no galas, no red carpets, just a mission to give recognition, scholarships, and a voice to women who had been silenced by circumstance, forgotten by history, or hidden behind someone else's spotlight. I knew how that felt. To whisper brilliance into someone else's success, to build an empire with invisible hands, and I knew the quiet joy of finally being seen. Outside my front door, I hung a small wooden sign, carved from the trunk of the old oak tree that once stood in our backyard. It read, "This home was built by a bird and enjoy the silence." The mailman laughs every time he reads it. I do too, because there's freedom in reclaiming what once broke you. On my refrigerator, I keep a child's drawing, a stick figure with glasses standing beside a giant light bulb in purple crayon. It says, "Grandma, you think better than Google." I nearly threw it away once. Now it's the first thing I see each morning, because sometimes the best legacies aren't left in wealth. They're left in wisdom. Even now, years later, when I sit by my window and watch the ocean breathe against the shore, I sometimes think about that house, the one they claimed, mocked, and lost. But the truth is, it was never the house that held my story. It was me. Every woman leaves behind a kind of architecture, not made of wood or stone, but of sacrifice, love, and the quiet choices that hold entire families together. Mine just happened to be written in ink they tried to wash away. Some nights, I still hear my husband's voice in my head. Not the businessman's, but the man who once whispered promises beneath the rose arbor. "Your light will outlast mine," he once said. He was right. It just took me a lifetime to let it shine without apology. I used to think silence was noble, that being the steady one, the supportive one, was the highest form of love. But now I know that silence, when given too freely, becomes surrender, and no woman should have to disappear to prove her devotion. The foundation has grown more than I ever imagined. Letters arrive from young women around the world, some engineers, some artists, some mothers. All of them carrying that same quiet fire I once did. They call me Grandma Eleanor now, though most of them have never met me. They tell me I gave them courage, but the truth is, they remind me why I kept going. Last week, I received a letter from one of my granddaughters, Catherine, the one who had laughed at me once. It was short, hesitant, but honest. "I'm sorry," she wrote. "You were never the ghost in our story. You were the author. I just didn't know how to read you back then. I smiled when I read it." Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it can make peace with it, and that, I've learned, is another kind of legacy. Every evening I sit in my old armchair, the same one they once marked with a sticky note, now polished and placed beside the window overlooking the sea. I call it the legacy chair. It's where I tell my stories now, the ones no one else dared to write. If you're listening to this, remember, your story doesn't end when they stop believing in you. It ends when you stop believing in yourself. So speak, write, remember, and if they ever try to erase you, pick up the pen and begin again, because silence may be golden, my dear. But truth is priceless, my dear ones. If you've stayed till the end, thank you for sitting a while beside me. Life has a way of wearing us down, doesn't it? But stories, they remind us that even when the world forgets our names, our choices still echo.